Welcome to Sweet Slides 101, our quarterly free webinar series on presentation skills. I'm Bethany Auk, the creative director of SlideRabbit. In this session, we learned how to trim down text and communicate more visually. Put any questions in the comments. Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn to join the next session live, or subscribe to our channel here to catch the replays. So today's session is all about how to use fewer words to communicate more. We want to take our slides from too wordy to wow. First of all, why is it important to reduce text, right? We hear it all the time, put less text on your slides, less words, but why does that benefit us as presenters? Why should we even care? Why do we even need to learn the skill sets to reduce our text? Any ideas? What have you heard? Engagement, focus, these are all great points. When we're speaking, we don't want our audience distracted by our slides. Helps the audience focus on the presenter, align with how our brains process information. Great. So let's just review some of those benefits. When we use fewer words, we can get better attention out of the audience. Exactly what someone said as it rolled through the chat. The audience can pay better attention to the speaker when they're not distracted by reading the words on the slide. People default to reading. So when we see words, we automatically go, I need to process this information. And because it's a little harder for us to process written word, we are spending mental energy on it and we're losing our connection with the speaker. Next, the fewer words you use, the more elements of more effective communication you can include. We process visual input more quickly and more easily. So if we remove text, then we can actually illustrate and annotate our main points on our slide. Third, avoid overwhelm. This literally just popped up in the chat, so that's great. Cognitive load. This is a thing that we must manage. When we overwhelm the cognitive load of our audience, they're going to miss a lot of what we're sharing with them. So by reducing text and simplifying our ideas, we can be more effective communicators. So let's kind of figure out where this all comes from. Basically, when we are writing in our typical working environments, our typical professional lives, we're using the prose style of writing. And that means that we're using complex sentence structures and we're sharing a lot of detailed information. Text is how we're communicating, so we have to be very kind of effusive and use a lot of verbiage to communicate complex ideas. But when we think about presentation writing, when we want to grab all those benefits that we just discussed in the chat and on our why use fewer slides slide, we need to switch how we're thinking about writing. So I want you to think of presentation writing as an entirely different style of writing than prose. When we have a presentation, we have limited space, right? We have one slide, and we really want to be using visuals because we know they communicate more powerfully. Because text can distract the audience, it's really a detriment for us to include too much of it. So we want to be as brief and succinct as we can with our writing. Today, to get from prose to presentation style writing, we'll explore 3 skill sets. The first is how to hunt the prose red flags. What are the signals that we can look for on our slides and in our writing that signal to us that we're using a prose style of writing? Next, how to express things visually. And I don't mean going straight to diagrams, although that's great, but even when we're using text, we can use visual cues to express ideas that we otherwise would have had to use many more words to express. Next, we want to talk about pacing information. By pacing information, we can use less text, but also place more impact on our important ideas. First, let's talk about hunting red flags. Again, these are the signals that our writing is not in a presentation style, but it's instead more similar to a prose style of writing. What are those red flags? First, obviousness. Anything that's obvious in the context of the presentation or the context of the slide, or because of the knowledge base of your audience, you should exclude from the slide. Redundancy. If we find ourselves repeating ourselves or repeating certain phrases and words, that's probably a sign that we have some text trimming that we can do. Qualifiers. If we're qualifying our main content of information, we're just kind of mucking up our main points. We want to make sure that we're giving on the slides the very small kernels of information we want people to take home, rather than giving them kind of qualifying independent phrases. Colloquialisms and connectors. These are a great sign that we're writing in the style in which we speak, or in which we write for, say, emails or reports. If we're using connectors, that means we're using complex sentences, so we want to make sure that we don't see those on our slides. And maybe the most difficult one, overly detailed information. People want to make sure that they're being honest and complete in their presentations, but when we include too much information, we then can't rely that the audience will find exactly what we want them to take away. So we need to be more selective about what we put onto the slide. So let's look at some examples. What do you see when I bring up this slide, right? It's hard to figure out what to take away. There's just too much to read, and there's no indicators of what's most important. It just looks like a laundry list of unimportant information. So it's really hard for the audience to engage in something like this, and it's distracting from whatever you are trying to point out as the important pieces of information on this slide. So let's see if we can hunt out some red flags to help us trim this text. First, we have a basic backgrounder up here in the title. Let me just say, your title is your biggest text on the slide. It should be used impactfully. Put your takeaway up there, right? What do you want people to take away? What's your argument for the slide? That can go in the title. But something like a basic backgrounder really imparts no knowledge that we need people to have. So let's get it out of there. Next, redundancy. If you find yourself repeating phrases, right here we have Tourette syndrome in the title, and then in almost every single bullet. So that's a red flag that we have some more trimming that we can do. Here is a qualifier. So really what we want people to know is the disorder usually manifests by age 11. But when we're qualifying information like this makes sense in your talk track, maybe even in a footnote or in a handout. But certainly when you're sharing those kernels of takeaway information on the slide, in most patients is not an important piece of this phrase. Which can be, this is a connector, right? We're connecting two thoughts into a complex sentence. That is a sign of prose writing. And of course, overly detailed information. When we give too much information, we are basically throwing so much at our audience and just kind of expecting or hoping that they'll pick out what's important. Instead, let's be selective of what we place on the slide and give them only the things we want them to take away. So after we do some trimming, a little wordsmithing, you can see we've also added like a colon. These are great tips and tricks to kind of express ideas without using all of those words. We're getting to something that's a little bit more manageable. It's still just a list of bullets, but with text like this, now we have more resting space for the eye. It doesn't look quite as overwhelming. And at least the text that you do read is all text that you need as far as the information you're supposed to glean. But we can take something like this and easily apply a couple little tips and tricks of design to make it even more what Nolan Haynes and many in the industry call glanceable. And that means that the audience can glance up and find some of the important information that they need. So what have we done here? Essentially, what we have is chunked text. Shorter widths of text are easier to read. So rather than putting text all the way across the slide, use a shorter width when you're designing text slides. Also, icons, great memory device. Yes, they're cute and fun, but they also can work to tie ideas together across a presentation. And then most importantly for a text slide, text emphasis. By just adding bold and some color, we can easily help people kind of find and zero in on that important information that they need to be taking away from the presentation. So there's the before and after on a slide like that. First, we hunted out the red flags. We wordsmithed to get down to those kernels of smaller information. And then we applied a little bit of design, nothing too complex, in order to make the slide a little bit easier to ingest and easier for the audience to interact with. So let's talk about using visual cues instead of lines and lines and lines of text. Now, it's true that we process images much faster than we process the written word, but we also understand visual cues quite organically as well. So when we are setting up information, we can use visual cues to express ideas rather than writing out in full complex prose sentences some of those ideas. So here's a before slide for a client. And I think, normally I say like always start with the red flags. Then you can kind of start to figure out what slides are actually about once we get some of the junk out of there. So we've definitely got some red flags. Throw them in the chat if you see them, but I'll go through some here. I see, of course, a lot of redundancy. We've got oral care products like mouthwash and toothpaste. Now, that is a qualifier or maybe a redundancy, maybe right on the line, but the main point is we don't need both, right? Whichever is more accurate we can use for this presentation. Including both is just kind of junking up the point of the slide. Also, of course, registration appears twice. Weak title, Riley Pierce, thank you. That is a weak title. It's what we call a labeling title rather than something that gives you any context or any takeaways for the information in the slide. Registration appears twice, great sign that we are being redundant and there's more we can pull out. The layout, someone's mentioned in chat, that's right. We're not doing very much of this layout. The formatting's all over the place. I will also point out that we have some connectors, but and so you can tell we're writing in complex sentences, and that's prose style of writing. This doesn't fit super neatly in our red flags, but I also just have to point out things like would be considered as. Would be considered as is a little bit of a word salad. Just make sure that you're always using the fewest words that you need to get the idea across. Instead of would be considered as, here we could just say is. So now we have to figure out what is the actual subject? What is the slide trying to tell me? Because I have to read, right now I have to read the whole slide in kind of an intense kind of all over the place way in order to get the point. But what are we talking about broadly? Does anyone know what the subject of the slide is? Can anyone tell kind of what we're supposed to be learning? We had someone already mention that we've got Trinidad and Tobago up here in the title. We know it's important because it's at the top, but it's not a strong title. It doesn't tell us what we should be learning. Bill Chan, what needs to be registered? There we go. So registration requirements for oral care products in Trinidad and Tobago. Great. So we know we've got Trinidad and Tobago. We know we are talking about registration requirements, and we know we're talking about oral care products. That's the subject of the slide, but it's kind of all over the place. You have to read halfway down to even kind of get there. We can clean up some of the junk from there. Now we know that what our main topics are. We can get rid of the very redundant phrases that we identified. Okay, so if we switch that up and now we've got the main topics up at the top, we've got a little bit less to process through. Right now, we still have to read the whole slide to get the main gist. Instead of writing in prose, we can look for relationships in our information to create glanceable layouts. And what I mean by relationships are things like progression. First this happens, then this happens, right? Cause and effect, balance. And in this case, comparison. We are comparing what does and doesn't need to be registered. And a comparison layout can simply be a side-by-side. So what are we comparing, right? We've got our cosmetics against our pharmaceutical products, then the types of claims, and then whether we need to be registering those or not. Here is just a simple comparison layout, side by side. In fact, comparison is one of the default layouts in PowerPoint for a reason, because if you're comparing two ideas, we typically put them side by side. By using visual cues like that, we don't have to write as much for people to understand what we're saying. Here we've got our claim types at the top, whether or not they require registration, and kind of some examples of what those claims might be. If we want to just apply a little design, now we've got a really nice slide that's fun to engage with. We've got glanceable text here with the emphasis on what requires and does not require registration. So we've gone from something that was a little overwhelming to process to something like this. Much easier to glean automatically what we're supposed to be comparing and how those two relate to each other without reading full sentences all the way down a slide. Next, it is important to pace your information. So someone mentioned earlier in the chat, which I'm thrilled about, that we have a cognitive load and our working memory can only handle so many things at once, which means when we're in learning mode, as we often are as an audience member in a presentation, we are processing things in our working memory. Our working memory has limited capacity and limited duration. So what that means is if I'm throwing too many things at my audience, they're just going to have to discard some of the information in order to kind of juggle around everything that they've got going on in there. And that's kind of a worst case scenario as a speaker because we don't have any control of what they might discard. When we're throwing too much at someone, what they're going to experience is called overload. And when overload happens, people just can't process any more information. So to avoid it, what we need to do is pace things at a more organic pace for our audience. So let's look at another example. Here's a slide from a presentation on geothermal energy. And the previous slides covered like its history and its recent advancements. But this slide contains like a ton of really big ideas, and they're all just in bulleted form. So it posits basically a whole hypothesis about the benefits of a geothermal system. But the content here, although it is great and very convincing, the bullet points just don't do it justice. If we cram too much onto one slide, it looks less important to our audience. So not only is this too many words, but it's not communicating in the way that it should be impactfully at all. Another note on pacing, if you have a slide with so much on it, once it gets up there, you sometimes feel the pressure of knowing people are reading, knowing it's been up there too long. And now all of a sudden you're presenting at a much faster pace than you should be, rushing through really important information. So pacing is not only a skill that will help the audience process, it will also help you as a presenter kind of stay in your lane and on point. Let's look at just these top couple points because otherwise we'd be here for the rest of the day. But firstly, again, a word on titles. I know a couple of people have mentioned it in the chat. This title is not doing anything. It's a label. We really want our titles to be maybe argumentative or giving our takeaway points, or at least telling people what they should be learning. So use this big text on your slide to be effective. All right, so let's look at the content of just these top bullets, right? So the top bullet says geothermal is plentiful. It's 1.5% can power us for 2 million years. Like that's an insane stat, but when it put it in just a bullet, it looks very unimportant. And similarly, these other arguments on this slide are quite impactful and something that you could spend as a speaker quite a while explaining and expounding on. When they're bulleted like this, though, you really take all that power away from them. So instead, what you can do is kind of what we like to call promoting information into its own slide, giving it its own moment. So if each bullet like this had its own time to stand alone and just like some simple graphics, you don't have to go nuts, right? Just the icons available in Microsoft 365 and then a little text emphasis. And now we have something that the audience can engage with and really remember. We remember visuals better. So now we've got something that is going to hit them with quite a bit more impact. Similarly, for the second slide, this is a Venn diagram. Diagrams don't have to be like new and like revolutionary to be effective because we recognize some concepts very well. A Venn diagram, we know what that means, right? That things are combining and things have different characteristics that overlap in certain places. So a Venn diagram can be a really powerful way to talk about the different characteristics and where they overlap. You don't have to reinvent the wheel to make a good graphic. And again, this is just 3 circles and some icons. Maps, right? If we're talking about, the places in the world and the existing infrastructure for geothermal energy, we can show that concept. I mean, this is obviously like not done accurately, but we're expressing a concept visually that's now going to have a lot more impact and a lot more ability to stick in the memory of the audience. Someone in this chat saying 1 idea, 1 slide. I do love it. I know, especially if we're making our major points at the beginning and the end of the presentation, it's always great. Sometimes when you're in a business presentation situation, we do need a little bit more information on our slides, and it's still possible, but reducing the text will help each one of those pieces of information be easier for the audience to process and understand. Okay, so this is just a reminder of where we came from the before slide there and the 3 after slides for just those top couple bullets. We're going to get to questions soon, so pop them in if you haven't. Otherwise, let's just quickly review today's takeaways. Okay, so what did we learn today? We learned that fewer words can actually say more. And editing is crucial to reducing text. We have to hunt those red flags in order to retrain ourselves from using prose in our working environment to using a presentation style writing. This is an important one, using layout to communicate ideas so that you don't have to write everything in text. The other thing about using a layout is you do get to then engage with your slides, especially if you're there in person, and point things out to your audience. Next, pacing your information increases retention and processing. So instead of running through quickly a list of bullets, consider pacing out your information slide by slide. One idea is great if you can get to it, and use simple graphics to help them, to help your audience process and remember that information. Okay, the next session registration is open. Audrey will put the link in the chat. We're going to cover data skills next time. We're going to learn to take a set of data just from a set of numbers to a clear and a persuasive story. So please register, and we'll hope you'll join us for that. Also, you can follow us in a bunch of places to keep up with our quarterly registration links. We'll have, you can always follow us on LinkedIn. This will go up on YouTube, and we will email out the recording. And we do have a newsletter if you're into hearing from us more often. So quick time for question and answer. I do see one in the chat that I will pick up quickly. And then Audrey, if you have any more, just let me know. Bob Brown asked, do I have any tips or ideas on icon selection? I like the idea of using the icon, but I always struggle with what to use. Yes, I do. And it's not revolutionary, but you can use the Microsoft Office search bar to search for literal interpretations of the icons. But when you're kind of trying to express abstract ideas, sometimes icons can feel a little underwhelming or incorrect for those opportunities. I like to just Google things and say, image for whatever the abstract idea is. And a lot of times you'll come up with, what are people using? So, marketing usually ends up being something like a microphone or a megaphone. It's not that we want to be cliche and reductive, but we do want to use symbols that people are familiar with, because that's how we create that memory link. The super cliches we want to stay away from, but using something that's familiar and not kind of reinventing the wheel every time is not a bad thing. Let's see. Will I post these slides? Sharon, I am posting the video. I don't see why we can't post the slides. I'll put a PDF and I'll link to that in the email when the video comes out. Okay, when editing before and after versions, do you open up multiple windows of PowerPoint? Yes, I have many screens. I mostly use two, but I almost always have my original on one slide and the one I'm working on in the front. Depending on your process, one of my coworkers has them before and after, and she just flips back and forth really fast. That makes me insane. I like two screens, but yes, I do tend to keep befores and afters both visible. Easy access for my brain. I receive feedback that my content is technical. What do you suggest? Great question. We work with a lot of pharmaceutical type clients and people in the biotech industry, and there's a lot of technical information in those typically. I recommend really thinking about your audience. What do they know already? What do they need to know? And what is either above or extraneous for them? It is hard to simplify very technical information and still feel like you're being complete. But think about just targeting the information to the audience that you're speaking to. And again, hunting out kind of where you're being complex in your writing will be helpful as well. Any other questions? Audrey, were there any in the questions panel, or are we getting them all in chat?
I did have someone private message me. How can you convince others at work, bosses, or technical employees that this is the way to go?
Right. We get this a lot because managing up is harder, obviously, especially from within the organization. Most of what we shared here today, like my red flags aren't scientifically based, but a lot of this is based in brain data, right? So it's data-driven insights about how we process information. So if they want to be effective communicators, that's something, that they should consider. Of course, it's a little hard to just walk into your boss's office and say they're a bad presenter. We do also offer training at enterprise level, which sometimes it helps to hear it from the outside. But there are a lot of other kind of thought pieces around that will help kind of hopefully communicate the importance of changing that style of writing. And someone in the chat says lead by example, which is a great point. If you can show them what a powerful communicator you can be with fewer words on your slide, you may just see some change happening internally. Any resources for our team for better image handling? And is that the size of the images or selecting them, or what are you having problems with? Selection, no watermarks, for instance. Yes. Okay. So image handling, right? You need to be buying images from stock sites or using royalty-free sites. Technically, if you're using your presentations in any sort of a public application. So when you're selecting images, there are like search things on Google, but I really recommend, getting a subscription to Adobe Stock or iStock or any of those. And then of course there is a bunch of free options as well, like Unsplash, and then being careful with them. And also you don't want to use the compression tool within PowerPoint. If you want to compress your files and not have loss on your images, you can use a tool called NX Power Light, and we use that internally, and it's pretty good for keeping your images from getting all crunchy. Is there one more? Oh, I see something in questions. Let's see. I make one slide status updates, and I see that Wordy. How can I make it visually impactful? Might have to know a little bit more about the content to be entirely helpful on that one, but I do like to relate the imagery or the visual that I'm using on a slide to the content at hand, so that there's kind of a memory and a processing tie happening. All right. Wow, that's a lot of questions. Thanks, guys. This has been really fun, and we are going to do this every quarter, so we'll hope to see you in a few months. But in the meantime, never hesitate to reach out, and we'll see you soon.